Welcome to Park Media. I'm your host, Vince Emanuele, and today we have a special guest in store for you, a friend of ours and someone we deeply admire, Avital Ronell, who is the Jacques Derrida Professor of Philosophy and Chair at the European Graduate School, as well as University Professor of the Humanities and Professor of German, Comparative Literature, and English at New York University. Her research and theoretical contributions extend across the fields of literary studies, philosophy, feminist theory, technology and media, psychoanalysis, deconstruction, ethics, and performance art. And as you will see over the course of our interview, Avital injects a sense of art and performance into everything she does. Enjoy. And I wanted to jump in just kind of by asking you just how the hell you've been holding up. I'm sure your routine has been disrupted as anyone else's, and sort of how you've been processing the last 9 months.
Well, I've been in a tumultuous period of my life. This is one of the offshoots of a kind of general downward spiral that has, if you read the right books and turn the right channels on, its own stealth epiphanies and dark, ecstatic kind of moments. So it's very bizarre to be part of, let's say, a general immunopathological downfall and have to look into hideouts in your psyche that can be kind of coached and coaxed to help you through very dark tunnels and times. So I'm very, as a philosophical and poetic sensibility, I'm always also motored by basic curiosity. And I'm also capable of being somehow energized by disaster. So it's not anything that I could offer a summation of as a coherent attitude or state of mind, because every 10 minutes, it used to be when you were in a disaster zone, take it a day at a time. So I'm like taking it half an hour at a time.
It was particularly like that in the beginning. I mean, one of the things that Sergio and I were thinking as soon as this happened was just how quickly, where we live in Northwest Indiana, of course, and I know this happened throughout the country in different parts, but people had rushed to the gun stores. They had rushed to purchase ammunition, and people were getting meals ready to eat, like the MREs we had in the military delivered to their homes, and stocking up on survival gear. And it was, I think, jarring for us to see how quickly things went from a so-called normal, which, there's all kinds of problems with that formulation of the way life was before or ever, but also how quickly we were reminded just how fragile this experiment is, how fragile this civilization, our lives, all of these protections and safety measures that we sort of put around ourselves in the way that we understand things. And then, boom, overnight, it seems that all of that can just be sort of flushed away. And then everyone is overwhelmed with a sense of like people's worlds getting very small, saying, okay, I want to protect me and mine and my family. And then in weird contradictory ways, at first, we see people singing outside of their balconies, and we've seen people kind of playing music with each other. 6 weeks later, there's uprising in the streets. There's people marching into the Michigan Capitol building with weapons. To me, having been someone who's been through war, and I think all of us have been through our own little wars in many ways, but having been through the war in Iraq, it made me. I'm not sure if I was more disturbed by that or more disturbed by the way that I saw things unfold over the last 9 months. And that's been an interesting reflection for me, thinking now at this point at 36 years old, that those are probably the two most jarring experiences that I've had in this life. So anyway, that's a meandering way not to even ask a question.
Oh, it's replete with questioning and self-questioning, and I applaud you, and I always admire the way you don't let yourself off the hook, and you're probing, you're analyzing, and you're feeling things in ways that may be contradictory or surprising. And I appreciate that in you. I also appreciate some of the implicit questions in your account just now. For example, what is a war zone? Where does a battle take place? And how are we even in terms of our whole immune system built as an immunopathological entity or apparatus that's fighting for you, or that's misrecognizing what constitutes an enemy? So that when you have an autoimmune illness or breakdown, it's because your internal sniper, let's say, protectors are misrecognizing the enemy. So one of the problems in the different kinds of battlefields, war zones, and spaces that we have to take, surveil, be very vigilant over, and worry about involves how they break boundaries. We're simultaneously protecting ourselves against the invisible viral load that's out to get us, a more or less invisible enemy, and yet we have to circumscribe the zone of action and call up. We in the United States have been quarreling and therefore warring over whether or not this constitutes a war zone. So that has stalled me in a certain way, because how do you even call it? Because we're accustomed to being structured in terms of a military, let's say, startup, in terms of command systems and hierarchies. It was never a question that maybe I'm mistaken and you can deconstruct or at least reset me here, but we expect to be commanded to move toward a troubled area and to try to secure it, change it up, fight for ourselves or against a certain circumscribed entity that we can provisionally call an enemy, which is something that I've been teaching about, by the way, enmity, the enemy, and how we know what constitutes an enemy, and can we even do without an enemy? But I'm going to put that to the side. So one of the, I would think, listening to what you're saying, one of the despairing aspects of all this is that it hasn't even been called. Is it a war? In France, where I was in lockdown last March through May, and they were pretty severe about locking us in and down and confining us. In France, the Macron called it a war. We're at war. Some people spat scorn at that and said, really, this is a war? And he said, yes, we have to rally our troops and our tropes. How do we talk about this? How do we not spread rumors, which are historically, they're competitive with war efforts. A rumor can really knock you off your course. It can undermine and subvert you in war, so that you, even in World War II, you'd have many posters saying loose lips sink ships. So that there's a competing, now there's three competitors. Let's say the spread of rumors, the war, the missiles, the missives that are sent out, and now the distress and destruction of the body that is prey to stray shots and killer viral attacks. However, what we need is the rhetoric and language that calls it. And I think we've been frozen in inaction or reactivity or self-destructive aggression turned against ourselves when there's no clarity about what this field of aggression is and how we're to respond to it. If our government had said with some sort of coherency and familiarity, so we could recognize the language calling us and calling it. If they had said, look, guys, we're at war and this is what we have to do. But even that's been frightfully ambiguated. So it's ambiguous. Are we at war? Or then we turned against one another. So there's a kind of tragic and comic destruction, which is, it's as if the country became an autoimmune lab that is killing itself off rather than bringing up defenses against other types of aggression. So we haven't even been able to legitimate the zone of aggression or fight. Or Americans are tough, very brave, very headstrong, stubborn in many ways, and they usually show up when they're called. But there was nothing about the call that was recognizable or serious. Instead, it became other little shocking displays of what I've been calling a nihilistic disclosure. So we're fighting one another. We're fighting ancient, regressive, racist, imaginary enmity, and we're miszoning some fields of defense work. At the same time, we can't be naive. These wars have been brewing and they have their own structure of implementation and installation, and people have been undermined and discriminated against in quiet yet pernicious warlike ways. They've been gagged and corseted and straitjacketed and undermined. So we also need to readjust maybe our understanding of war. What are we fighting? When are we fighting? When are we not fighting, by the way? And where is there not conflict? And after asking all these questions, we'll have to ask the nuclear question, which is, why are we getting off on this? Because clearly all of this aggression that Freud already located as our death drive, which involves addiction too. I mean, there's something that he called and located beyond the pleasure principle. That's also the title of one of his important late works. In other words, we're not just in it for the pleasure of life or life-affirming gestures and acknowledgments and delights, because that's not enough. We have to kill it. And our vocabulary corroborates that when we really want to indicate intense pleasure beyond the pleasure principle, we say we had a blast, we nuked it. So there's always killer rhetoric to indicate extreme joy and pleasure that goes beyond pleasure, but actually activates a death drive, so that it's only in encountering our finitude or limits and death that a true kind of dark, joyous kind of upward collapse can occur. I don't know if you ever experienced that in combat, that the closer you were to endangering yourself or snuffing yourself out or being snuffed out, there was some sort of unaccountable ecstasy.
Beyond what I could possibly articulate, and I think this is something that a lot of people, gosh, how do I say this? Sergio's shaking his head as Sergio and I met in the Marine Corps, so we've been friends for 18 years now, and you brought up a term, and it is what Sergio was, which is a sniper, as a matter of fact. We were in the same platoon for some time, and then he left and became a sniper in another platoon during our second deployment. It's hard to talk with folks who aren't veterans, and even more so combat veterans, and even within that milieu, the people who know that they've taken other people's lives or have been around extreme violence and death in that way. It was the most exhilarating, confusing experience, and yet filled with ecstasy, goosebumps, songs that I hadn't thought I would remember in years rushing through my head as I'm driving through the Iraqi desert in the back of a Humvee after having killed the first person that I knew that I killed for sure, because this person was feet away from me. And coming back to the base, driving under the stars in Mesopotamia, taking it in. It's a beautiful view. It's beyond what I think most people can imagine in terms of seeing stars like that without any light pollution. And getting back to the base and kind of walking around and smoking cigarettes and telling my friend that I was very confused because politically and morally, ethically at that point, I was opposed to the war. I knew that what we were doing there was not right. And yet at the same time, in a very deep subjective level, I had this feeling doing something I knew in the long run I would pay the price for. I even knew it in that moment. I mean, I knew in that moment you're going to pay a psychic, emotional price for this over the long term. And yet still felt those feelings of ecstasy. And of course, this is why a lot of veterans and others who've dealt with certain types of trauma sort of, we're always seeking something. I mean, I'm still smoking cigarettes today, but I'll do that after maybe running 5 miles in the morning. And then at night, I still want to, maybe have sex 3 times a day and eat a gigantic meal. That's a 6-course meal. And there's this, I mean, of course, the clinical description is post-traumatic stress disorder. I also have what they call traumatic brain injury because I was in Humvees that were rocked with, shock waves from explosions. And so I know that there's something physiologically going on that's also kind of kicking these things into motion, but there's something way deeper than that. And it's funny you mentioned Freud, because I told Sergio that the book that I've been returning to throughout this period has been Civilization and Its Discontents. And I've been back and forth revisiting that over the last 9 months, and even in the days leading up to this interview, thinking it could come in handy just talking about some of this. But yeah, to answer your question, a level of ecstasy that's dangerous, that's addictive, that's confusing.
I think it's very brave of you and so welcome that you can acknowledge the high-speed runs you've been on, and the libidinal surges and the great sex it sounds like you've been able to include in your repertoire of post-traumatic voracity, because it sounds like you've been blessed with manic capacities to devour the world and affirm existence in excessive ways. Obviously, if I were a therapist, I would not be now singing a Nietzschean song of praise to you. I would say, okay, how are we going to, calm this down? But that's not let me just, I know everyone knows, but I must say as a disclaimer, I'm at your feet and listening to you as a poet, philosopher, writer, and not in a therapeutic kind of restraint, which, by the way, this country is almost oversaturated with. It's very interesting how so much of the healing mythologies and language have leaked through to the most improbable spaces and social behaviors. Sometimes I find it problematic, but I'm always astonished to see that so many are keyed into therapeutic horizons. That in itself deserves to be acknowledged and marked. At the same time, for example, just to give you an example, it's a little off-ramp here, but there's a lot of stock put in resiliency in trauma therapies and studies. And I think that might be too bouncy optimistic, and too recuperative, to speak with Derrida. In other words, there's often a move in all our thinking. It doesn't have to be heavy and barely intelligible philosophical work, but there's often a desire to recuperate something. In other words, to say, yeah, that was really bad, but I grew. But it taught me so much. It's my teacher. That, I think, is a little reckless. In the rest of the world, it's often said, from shopkeepers to to rocket scientists, that Americans get off on violence more than anyone else, which isn't true. Everyone has their own brand, I'm sure, and style and conventions of violence. But Americans need to go around the world and bomb the shit out of people. This is part of our legacy that you are bravely confronting, and also with the understanding that this country, the North American USA country, started up with violent warfare and destruction. So we shouldn't be surprised when destruction pops up and claims the territory, including our throats. I mean, the reason I brought up the body and the autoimmune pathology that we're now up against the wall with is that there's no limit to the aggression that has been courted, has been performed, has been valued by this country. And it's dishonest not to go right in there and say, okay, why is it that we get off on murderous, ecstatic assignments rather than repress, as you've seen in Freud's text? I find it so impressive that that's your companion species in text, civilization and its discontents. In German, the word is Unbehagen, which is more like queasiness or discomfort, your discomfort zone in civilization,
I wanted to ask about discomfort. It brings up something, it's sort of tied to the technological question. It's also, it seems to me, tied to a question that goes from a subjectivity, but then also how we collectively deal with this. And thinking about people who have dealt with extreme trauma and violence, oftentimes when I speak with veterans, I'm going to try and find a way to tie all of those together, but oftentimes when I speak with veterans who have come home recently from the war, I sort of have two what would seem contradictory pieces of advice for them. Number one would be that they have to connect socially, have a decent social network of people that they could spend time with, share stories with, share emotions with, and at the same time, to sit alone and to really sit on that despair and that confusion. And sometimes, veterans are confused, and I've experienced this myself, where I've tried to keep myself so busy that you can't think about it, or I've sat by myself too much, and starting to go into my own little worlds that sometimes can be very unhelpful. Um, so to be able to do both of those things, and then in this context with technology, on the one hand, this allows us to connect. But something that scared me from the beginning of this was how quickly everyone jumped from, okay, now we'll go to FaceTime, Zoom meetings, Zoom this. We'll stay connected as much as we can, plus Netflix, plus my phone, plus my iPad, plus my iPod. And it seemed to me that this maybe was a good time for, especially in a nation that's almost uber optimistic about everything. Oh, we can always do it. There's always going to be progress. We can always solve this problem. To maybe sit back and to really sit in that despair and confusion, and which is so contrary to, I think, a lot of the ideals that our popular culture, sort of promotes, instant gratification, be happy, wear a smile. And simultaneously, we're 5% of the world's population and eating 80% of the psychotropic medications in the world. I mean, wild contradictions, and yet it would seem to me that this would be a good time for our country to step back, sit in that despair, reflect, to think in a really deep way. And yet, so even with the technology, it allows us to speak to each other, but maybe prohibits us from really doing the thing that we needed to do in this time.
I think it's wonderful. And let me applaud your lucidity and your caution, your sense of worry. And if we stop worrying, I worry. In Heidegger's important work, okay, he's a problem, but his work is not. Being and Time, worry, or Sorge in German, anguish, anxiety, is disclosive of understanding. If you don't worry, if you're not anxious, if you're not freaked out, then you will never try or seek to understand something. You'll close it off or foreclose it or be blind to it because you're on some manic spree or psychotically averting confusion. I think your advice is outstanding. And, contradiction in some sectors of our existence should be welcome and should be mandatory even, because, by the way, in the history of philosophy, it's Aristotle who rallied against contradiction. He wanted non-contradictory assertions, coherency, but life doesn't totalize. It doesn't total up. It doesn't offer a non-messy, non-leaky, uncontaminated zones of utter confusion and endangerment. So if one can abide by what Derrida called the both and rather than either or neither nor, that exclude, according to an oppositional logic, your options. But if you can do exactly what you say, improbably somehow balance in a tensional structure that doesn't get resolved, but that you are sitting with as a responsible being, if you can get to that place where you at once engage socially, do what you can to produce a social aspect or even overpopulate yourself with so-called friends or allies or create kinship. And at the same time, go to your dungeon where you lean into the emptiness and the despair and you sit with it without reprimanding yourself, but sit in the horror of being. Because being is a horror. And the more we repress it and go to Disneyland and create infantile diversions, the less we can actually open up to it and sit with it and practice a certain demonology, like invite the demons to the empty table and say, okay, let's have at it. Or let's sit quietly, shut the fuck up. My demons, just come in, shut up. Let me look at you in my inner, vision or with my night goggles and check you out, check me out, and bring me this close to my extinction. And then let me bound out, help others. You know what I noticed is that a lot of people don't realize how grounding it is to rigorously help others, take care of the hungry, the destitute. And it's something of a social injunction that we should listen to, because I think that allows you at once to socialize and to accept your desocialized tremors as well. So the more complicated the itinerary, the better off we'll be. That might sound bizarre, but when you go to war and have an aim and have a program of destruction, that's simplistic stuff, I would think. Yep. It's much more complicated to devour the being of the purported enemy, to introject, to hold, to wonder, to hesitate rigorously, to what you were saying earlier, to really get a close-up of the fragility of the other and of the self and of the one engaged in, war has aims and it thinks it knows what it's doing and it behaves that way. But aggression would be significantly dosed down, I am assuming this is a hypothesis, if we were in an affirmative way unsure of our ground. You couldn't imagine a leadership that would say, let's hesitate together and lean into our national emptiness and not be sure where we're going right now. Let's count the dead that we host internally and externally. Let's memorialize. Let's figure out the things that you can't figure out, or at least keep them close and welcome. Let's talk to the dead. Let's talk to the spectral realms that do and don't count, that haunt and hound us. Those kinds of utterances don't belong to a so-called politics that seems sure of itself. So I would ask for less national security in a philosophical sense. How about some national insecurity for a change? And let us tremble and shiver and be in horror of what has been done in our names. And let's stop this pride nonsense. I know that sounds really, to some people, it would be offensive, but please accept me as a highly offensive philosophical sensibility. That's my job description. It's not my personality. I'm actually shy, but it's my duty, I feel, my responsibility to make trouble, to provoke, to wake up, to, in some districts, put to sleep, help people get past their insomniac anxiety about what we've done, what we are, and who signs our names to these terribly destructive, perverse runs that this country has become known for. I'm not merely denouncing things. I'm fascinated and blinded by the aggression that we have always been excited about. And when you say, I'm proud to be an American. I find that utterance problematic about anything. I'm not a proud. I like to sink into humility, into existential poverty zones where there's nothing to be proud of. I mean, it's more effortful not to seal off your effectiveness or your affect with something like pride. That's like a glue that seals things off. And what is it you're proud of? This might sound a little too untried and unproven, and I apologize for not having prepared, let's say, a careful demonstration of the dangers of pride, but we know that it's one of the sins. What would it be to truly exercise humility, anxiety, to let it kind of shake us up instead of, as you were indicating earlier, people like to shake problems off. They don't like discomfort. They don't welcome it. They think it can be a fast lane, an easy pass to get through the most. I mean, discomfort is very uncomfortable. I'm not talking about extreme with you. I'm not talking about extreme danger or pain. That's another existential lever and problem. But discomfort, I'm so glad you chose that, because it's no one wants discomfort. And then you do all sorts of foolish things to kick it away from you or knock it out of your field of activity or passivity. So being with discomfort would be a real notch, a real step forward, I would think, to be able to hold discomfort, which we, as you said, with our ideologies and techniques of instant gratification and the erasure of death and the spontaneity and instantaneity that is promised by technology, all of that is part of a death denial series of theories and behaviors that we should be aware of. What would it be like every morning to flash your beautiful smile and say, let me be in discomfort today? It doesn't even register because it's something that we immediately try to release from our vicinity.
And takes a certain level of discipline, which is a word and a concept that Sergio and I speak about quite regularly. I say that as a complete hypocrite who can't give up smoking even after going to the gym every day for the years and years of my life. But there's a discipline, the concept of discipline, I think is really important. I think it requires discipline to keep yourself on that path. I think as you're speaking, it makes me think about vulnerability is another thing that our culture, the society, the systems that really dominate our lives do not promote. But I think is sort of synonymous. I think vulnerability for me is sort of synonymous with my concept of love. And so vulnerability, love, and then, but not avoiding that friction, knowing that there's beautiful things that happen, even with your body. I mean, if you go to the gym and you're lifting weights, you're tearing your muscles. You're literally tearing those muscles apart, and then they're able to rebuild. And by rebuilding, this is the same with music, a string instrument. There's all this friction and tension that's happening with the way that it's constructed, the bow that you're using, if it's a violin, and the strings and how tight they're strung. And forgiveness and certainty. Certainty that there's somebody steering the ship when in fact there's no one steering the ship. That there's going to be a resolution to things, that there's going to be an ending, I know you've spoken about this at length over the years, that we can sort of neatly package up this nice little ending and finish line and put it out of our minds, I think is still an issue. And forgiveness. Sergio and I spoke about this, and we're not going to get into it at all, but I thought you would find it funny that, as we were talking about doing the interview, it's like, oh, do you think this person or that person would mind? First of all, we could give a flying fuck. Second of all, what I said to Sergio was, I've met Iraqis. If they get upset with me, anyone who gets upset with me in life, I tell them, look, I've met Iraqi people over the years, refugees at anti-war events that I was speaking at, who came up to me in tears and hugged me and said, I forgive you for killing what could have been my brother, my cousin, my son. I forgive you for that. If they can forgive me for killing their family members, surely you can forgive. And I think this is something that there's a level of humility and vulnerability to our ability to forgive at a time when everything is so, did this person say that? And if they did, let's jump them, let's get them, like, let's tear them down. It seems to be precisely the wrong approach at this time. And especially at a time when, shifting a little bit, looking at the situation we face globally, at a time of climate crisis, when we know there's a certain amount of destruction already baked in. So no matter what we do, X amount of things are going to unfold over the next couple of decades. We're going to have to deal with them. That means millions of people perhaps moving internally and out of the country, from the coasts, away from the coasts. To me, that looks like a lot of humility. It looks a lot of something else you talk about, hospitality. It looks like a lot of vulnerability. It looks like a lot of forgiveness. It does not look like a lot of the things that we see now, which is that sort of hyperpolarization, the immediate jump to sort of judge, the immediate jump to sort of cast people off permanently, even. Like, we can block people in real life, but we can't block people in real life. We actually have to speak with them. There is no deleting someone if you're not on social media. That's what that makes me think of. It makes me think of all of those things and how we tie a lot of those concepts together, and how they might not only help us subjectively within this context, but in the future, a very uncertain future context that we face.
I had a friend who smoked the way you describe your smoking habit, and I asked him, whom is he smoking, or what is this about? Because smoking is part of a gestural syntax, let me say, a gestural syntax of introjecting, incorporating the smoky, absent, spectral other. And he said it was his father, that this was a daily, repetitive morning ritual for him to smoke in his father, and to remember his father. I just wanted to roll that up and light it up for you and pass it back to you to figure out why it is you're attached to smoking, which has a lot to say for itself in terms of an incineration, a destructive habit, that you're stepping on the accelerator and the brakes simultaneously, smoking, going to the gym, breaking down your musculature and building it back up, but then undermining your pulmonary zones, which is right now what's being targeted by COVID as well. So you are creating a national vulnerability, or recreating one, and that I'd love to see you be able to give up. You're still at the age where you can turn it around and support your body more fully. But I wonder what the smoke is about. And is it a war, a residue, a remnant of precisely the unforgivability of the disaster that you've been made to traverse? Is that your memorial, your smoke signals to despair? I would want to understand why you seek forgiveness from those who cannot, philosophically speaking, offer forgiveness, you know? And I'm very touched, and I know what it is like to want to have a word said on one's behalf and exonerate one, and publicly or in an inscriptive, serious way, pronounce you not guilty. I don't know if that's possible. I'm too much of a Kafka baby to think that there would be any tribunal that could get you off those terrible hooks, you know, of carrying one's debt and one's guilt to an interminable level of intensity, which is not necessarily only a curse, but it's the absolute and luminous burden that you carry very uniquely, Vincent, really. So if you want to absolve your experience of guilt, you might be snuffing out something that is really powerful in you. That would be a response to your, also to the discipline of your journey, which I really applaud, because I think discipline, I mean, people make fun of me. I'm highly disciplined. And it's quirky. It's almost bizarre. I mean, what is the boundary between obsessional neurosis and discipline, you know? What does it mean to follow orders? Who's giving me orders and keeping me in line? And what is the order of the order? Yet, I wonder if the art of discipline is vanishing. You know, is anyone proud to be, and I've already expressed my concern with any kind of pride, but if there's pride, and obviously I'm concerned about, can one be proud of one's so-called accomplishment, of one's efforts, and even if one is prey to cancel culture and sudden erasures of entire histories of that one thought one was firmly strapped into, you know, suddenly you're ejected. And the question would be, if it were possible to have some pride, would it be in terms of discipline and honorable, an honorable encounter with that which is absolutely unsavory and inadmissible in your own history? You know, can you honor it without absolving or forgiving that debt? That's where I see your discipline, that you may seek forgiveness or what you're calling forgiveness, but I also see you sitting with the unforgiven in your history, which is admirable and highly disciplined in itself.
I appreciate the gesture. I think when I've met the story that I referenced, for instance, there's sort of hardly only one because of the amount of events we've done over the years, but it's not, I appreciate the gesture itself. I think it can momentarily lighten the load when I'm perhaps too hard on myself, when I want to sit too much in that dungeon, when I perhaps beat myself up more than I should. And again, for me, it's, you know, you want to, it seems also wrapped up with concepts of progress, that there's these, that we find these progress traps that we don't foresee, thinking that we're growing, looking to grow, looking to get over things. No, I couldn't agree more. I think it's the only It's sort of the same, I think, with the pandemic. In other words, I've heard people say, when this is over, I never want to hear about it again. And I think that's the most unethical thing we could possibly do with the pandemic. Again, that doesn't to me mean that every single TV show, conversation, book, or joke needs to reference the last 9 months or whatever the final count will be of this particular episode. But and at the same time, to just again move on seems totally unethical, and it seems that way in most things. But also, this concept of certainty, I think, is something that I've been thinking a lot about. This idea that there are people at the helm of this highly complex, interconnected web of technologies, economic relations, political relations, that there's someone or something sort of guiding the ship or steering the ship. And I think that too is something that collectively maybe some people have had to come to terms with. I know I've had conversations. There's been people who have reached out through phone calls over the last 9 months that I haven't heard from in a long time. And what they want to discuss varies, but usually it goes back to maybe stories about how we first met, different memories we might share, but then also really big reflections from people who might not normally call me or send messages like that, but really interesting, deep, thoughtful reflections from people who have been forced to slow down a bit and take a look at this bigger project that we are a part of. And I think it's something that I've been obsessed with, is the concept of civilization, perhaps because we fought a war in the cradle of civilization, because we're at the edges of civilization and sort of the latest empire in a string of empires in the U.S. empire. People talking about the end of civilization today in this, in the context of climate change and ecological devastation. So from the hyper-personal, subjective, sitting in that, all the way to the biggest questions of how do we navigate a world with 7.8 billion people and growing, to me seems we should be having both conversations. And what's frustrating, I think, about some of the work that Sergio and I do, political work, is that when you're organizing, when you're doing these things in movements and campaigns, you have to speak in the slogans and you have to use a sense of certainty. And yet during the day, I am certain that my neighbors and friends need Medicare for all because they need healthcare. I also go home and have nothing but questions about what we're doing, how we're doing it, can we win? Maybe one of the prerequisites I think I would suggest for people who are getting involved with political work is to maybe come to terms with the fact that there maybe is no hope for the long-term project, that we can transform society in this new way. And I think maybe by sitting in that, accepting that there might not be hope, only then can we open up and maybe think about possibilities that didn't exist, or at least be able to deal with what we're dealing with without this sort of never-ending cult of positive thinking, which is wild that, Trump's dad spent a lot of time with the pastor who made that famous in the United States. And it's not surprising, but it's also not surprising that even some of my, sort of left-wing friends have hit me with things in the last 9 months that are like, I know we're going to be good by Christmas. I just feel it, and I think, wow, that cult of positive thinking, you might make fun of Trump for saying these things, but my God, how does it impact all of us? And of course, I'm not immune to any of this. I mean, I think all of us are implicated in one way or another, but those questions, I think, also arise, that interplay between the responsibility we have collectively, how we deal with that, and how we process that, when we are in our dungeons.
I want to say something in response to what you beautifully lay out, but it might sound extreme, so bear with me. But when you say, I beat myself up more than I should, of course, again, if I were speaking as a therapist or another kind of socially motivated personality, I would say something different than I'm about to. But ethically, since that was the pitch on which you started that thought, one cannot beat oneself up more than one should. One should beat oneself up. And at some level, it should be an infinite pummeling. Of course, I'm hyperbolically trying to entertain that thought, and I don't want to trouble people. But I don't think that one can say that about oneself more than one should. One can really put oneself up against the wall, motherfucker, you know, and force an answer to the unanswerable, to the unbearable, to witness the unbearable. So that, in fact, I quite agree with you that there might be more questioning about, and this is part of built into by now our culture, which is I'm over it, forget about it, move on. There's far too quick a disavowal of something that you want to put away or do away with. So can we press the emergency brakes and say, no, I'm not going to get over it. I'm not going to move on. I'm not doing the fast food, fast thought, fast penance thing. But it may not be something that should be stopped, you know, as part of the making and the attentive, attuned kind of devoted worry about a semi-full life. I think it would have to include sessions with oneself where one's really quite the taskmaster and merciless persecutor in a way. I do think that our more refined relation to the persecutor in you, outside of you, might be something that we could accommodate rather than always think we've moved on, because then it comes around to bite you in the ass. You know, when it's what Freud calls the return of the repressed. If you think you've adjourned something and taken care of, or you don't want to hear about it, or you don't want to overdo the self-punishing wailing, you might be wrong. You might want to just integrate that part of you and say, okay, come here, sweetie, and start crying and be that unresolved despair that I carry with me all the time. I'm going to let you have a seat at the table or a voice in the psyche and a dreamscape at night. You know, you belong to the horror of existence, the beauty of existence. And as long as one disavows horror, one doesn't have the access code or entry permit to beauty, it seems to me. So I do appreciate that you hesitate and trip over the very idea of progress. I know you've recruited it to think through your, that you want to grow, you want to make progress. It may be that in certain areas of traumatic cratering, one can't mature or grow anything. And one has become, as Nietzsche says, a desert. Nietzsche cried out that the desert is growing, meaning an existential devastation. You know, Heidegger made a distinction between, upon reading Nietzsche, he made a distinction between devastation and destruction. And destruction, according to Nietzsche, is good to the extent that you destroy what has been destroying you and eating at you. You set it aside rigorously, you kick it to the curb, you wrestle it down, it's a bad object, and you destroy the destructive, which means that you clear the way for the future. It's a pledge to the future. Whereas devastation, nihilistic devastation or devastating destruction but let me not use destruction because I'm opposing them provisionally, according to Heidegger's reading of Nietzsche. Devastation is just closes everything down. It fucks everything up. It messes everything up. And there is no future. There's no promissory note. There's no new hope or horizon that you were indicating. So I find the distinction drawn here between destruction. Sometimes you have to destroy things, get people out of your lives. We have cliches that cover that eventuality, like he was toxic, I was in a toxic. So that's a Nietzschean thought, that there are areas in existence and histories and relationships that are toxic and must be cleaned up or run away from. Nietzsche broke up with everything. It was very hard for him, but that was his kind of code of ethics, to break up, break off, and as you have been doing with former histories of the self, or former convictions, former attachments. He made it a practice. He said, we owe it to ourselves to break up and break off from things that have become devastating and stop life and refuse to affirm life. So I'm very, very interested in the way you're going about things, and also staying with the trauma, that you are strong enough, the vulnerability, that you're strong enough to host and hold and talk to and about. That's something that we all need to do. And certainly we need to slow down in order to, we are like speed freaks, culturally speaking and nationally speaking. Everything has to be faster and faster. And that's a way of also refusing to surveil the devastation that has been wrought. And that's something that is kind of, I don't usually use this vocabulary, a sin. It's a sin not to slow yourself down and review your disastrous moves or stalls or breakdowns or refusals. Just to review it, that is already quite enough. There's not always much you can do about anything, but you can be in its grim determination and try to understand some things without pretending to or presuming to totalize and say, okay, I've taken care of that issue. That's why Freud has the double movement of terminal and interminable. So things are ending and unending at the same time, you know, and that's hard to live with. But I think we are charged, especially nowadays, to live with that tensional structure, in that tensional structure where things are not resolved. And if they are appearing as resolved, that's often false and falsifiable and problematic and will jump at you at a certain moment when you're caught off guard, you know? And it's hard. So to go back to Freud and civilization and its discontents, it's hard to live with the unresolved. That's almost our traumatic duty.
And that there might not, well, in fact, that we don't have a purpose here, that there is no, you know, we don't know what the fuck we're doing here. I mean,
God forbid we should have a purpose. I'm so tired of people thinking.
Yeah, Sergio's going.
Purpose. You got to say, yeah, shut that down.
Yes.
You know, shut that down. That's a presumption that has a whole history of inflated selfhood that's philosophically mapped. Kant can help. Immanuel Kant here can help us with this. He has a notion of very important of purposiveness without purpose. In other words, you can set yourself, you can discipline yourself with purposiveness vis-a-vis your friends, the animals, your worlds, everything that you try to be just toward, or even in your injustice. But you can have purposiveness. This is the Kant's definition, by the way, of an artist, a creative being, which in some ways we all share in or have split off from. Every child is creative. Why have they stopped or been stopped? But in any case, to act with purposiveness, without purpose. In other words, you're not subjugated to a reason. Why'd you do this? Or or a purpose, a concept. You don't have to, as Nietzsche says, bow before his lordship when he asks you, what have you come up with today? What are the yields of the day? And you say, nothing. No, but I have been purposiveness without making myself reducible to having purportedly fulfilled some purpose, so it's even harder to live having renounced purpose, but being still purposiveness, and even more responsible than if you were on assignment with some pernicious purpose.
Let me, how could I say, round out a conversation that I don't want to end, but that
Thank you.
but that I know we have a limited time. Let me ask about the concept of love, Avital, because we've talked about so much that I think we've given folks enough challenges, perhaps. Not that love isn't challenging, perhaps the most challenging.
Yeah.
Maybe, how could I say? I'm interested, perhaps I'm most interested about this because I've never asked you about it, one. Two, because I had a conversation with Michael Hart recently about him and Negri's latest book, Assembly, which I found really, really fascinating. And he talks about the concept of love as a political concept and how people look down upon this immediately as soon as you bring it up. I found this interesting during the Democratic primaries, of course, because the person who brought this up was Marianne Williamson. Now, here's a woman who a lot of people tried to cast off as, oh, she's kind of into all this new age hippy-dippy bullshit, and she's doing this and doing that. But I wasn't that aware of her prior to the primaries, but what I found interesting were the topics that she spoke about. She spoke about trauma in a very real way. She spoke about the wars. She spoke about the pain and suffering of Native American genocide and displacement and assimilation. She spoke about the pain and suffering of slavery and institutional racism in a way that a lot of other candidates didn't. And she talked about love. Now, of course, that's a huge concept that people have different, ideas or about what that is and all the rest. But I find it interesting that we don't talk about it. I find it interesting that as a political concept, it's sort of foreign to our discourses on politics. I like that. Another book that I revisited in the last 9 months was Alain Badiou's book on love. And I like that he talks about love as, not something to be glamorized, as something that's tricky and dirty and challenging and loaded with contradictions. And it's not this fairy tale, that it's about like actually digging in and dealing with all of those trials and tribulations that you find along the way of loving anything, including yourself. I wonder how you think about some of these concepts. Love, maybe, do you think it can be applied politically? Are there dangers to doing that? And then also, how do we think about love today? And again, another wonderful contradiction that I've been sitting in for 9 months. I felt closer to some people over the last 9 months of not seeing them than I did when I saw them every day. And I can imagine if we can see each other again in the near future, that I will probably appreciate that time more than I would have in the past. So it's made me think about everything from death tied in with love, but also, on this side of how am I thinking about love vis-a-vis myself, vis-a-vis intimate relationships, the other, people I've never met before, people around the world whose pain and suffering we're also sitting with. That's something that I've been, wanting to ask you about.
Wow, that's a doozy. I'm very touched that you're in love with the world and non-presence, and you're tuned into those who are suffering, and that shows what a large range of love you're capable of, and also thinking in terms of. I would say that once you call it a concept, it's no longer as exalted as it might be. I think it probably breaks out of conceptual arrest. And certainly there are histories of different kinds of love among the Greeks, agape and so on. There's also Christian love, which with its promiscuity, which has you loving everyone and everything and your enemy, and oh my God, you're loving all over the place, uncontrolled and unboundarized. So there's all sorts of quasi-ethical exhortations to love. But as Lacan, the great psychoanalyst who rethought Freud, has pointed out, first of all, love is like military duty, he says. You report for duty, there are rules, you better get on it. You have, you can be severely punished for messing up. Your life is at stake. I don't know what you're shooting off, but there's, for him, it's a military predicament and joy even, that involves military discipline. But he also says what a catastrophe it was to have been saddled with the teaching, love your neighbor as you love yourself, because we hate ourselves. We sabotage ourselves. We undermine ourselves at every possible juncture, even when we're not aware of it. So if you love your neighbor, which we've really shown how we do that, the way we love ourselves, you're going to destroy the shit out of them. So first of all, that has been an injunction that has a poison spear on it. We need to also probably indulge the semantic range of contradictory manifestations of love. Aristotle asks the question, is it better to be loved or to love? And he has a whole beautiful thinking that gets assimilated into his thinking of friendship. What is friendship, and what is the love of a friend, and what is love? He points out that it's much, much better and more dangerous to love than to be loved. Because first of all, to love requires you to man up, discipline, or woman up, and declare your love. So take a risk. It's very risky. That might be very harmful and painful. And he goes on to say that exemplary friendship and love of the friend should actually resemble the love of the ancestor. So it's non-requited, it's non-reciprocal. You offer your love the way you commemorate and think of those who are no longer with us. That's why I was very touched when you said now, as people whom you're close to are non-present, you feel the love. So that would be an Aristotelian structuring of a relation to one who has withdrawn, who's no longer materially present, but whose aura is ever more part of your zone of reverence and care, precisely because this doesn't mean that you can only love the dead or the ancestor, but can you imagine integrating that into your love for this other whom you don't reduce to the same, as Derrida says. He says, our problem is we make these narcissistic annexations. We say, I love him like a brother. I love you like a part of me. So where is the other in all that? What would it be like to love the other as though she were non-present, dead, inassimilable, remote, existing or not existing in another sphere of intemporal haziness? So could you enact that with the most intimate companion, what about your love for your pets? There are some theoretical works that I remember. Someone called Mark Schell wrote The Family Pet, an essay where he shows how we pet the pet in order to somehow bypass incestuous urges, so the whole family is petting this substitute object and loving to death your dog, your best friend, and kind of scorning your so-called love object. I'm interested in the way love displaces itself or sublimates or goes elsewhere and can't handle the truth of itself, so to speak, So that would be some preliminary response to your surprise attack of a question on love. But I would also want to be responsive to the political action that would consist in something as nebulous and elusive as love. It could be dangerous, and it could solidify into love of country or some sort of unifying mystification and fusion with the other. That, again, Nietzsche tells us, if you love, you can only love disproportionately, in disidentification, not in glomming onto the other or kind of pocketing the other's otherness or singularity, but in finding distance, which he called in German Distanz. So it's a dance of difference. And it's a dance that never takes the other as hostage or prisoner, but has a relationship of that acknowledges the unreadability of the other. Like, who the fuck is this? Like, not you're like a part of me. It's like you're an alterity, an other that I could never translate or understand. And you're inexhaustibly majestic, precisely to the extent that I don't understand you. So I'm not going to close in on you or close you down because I have a conclusive or definitive understanding of you. And that's a difficult practice of love, which is that of non-understanding and just the reverence or awe you might have. Don't forget that awe sounds like awful, and it comes from that. It's awesome. So when the other is awesome, the other is sublime, which Immanuel Kant, differentiated from the beautiful. So the sublime is something that you can't wrap your head around. You can't reduce to a concept, a begriff, or a grasp. You can't grasp it. So if it were possible to think with Nietzsche and Derrida and others, this dissymmetry in love. Like, I'm not the same as you. I'm certainly not above you. You're way above me, but I can't grasp you. And it makes me crazy as well, this non-totalizable you. We could maybe make a song, you know. That's a hard kind of discipline to honor and to live with. And then if we had 5 more hours, I would ask you what the granting here is, how not to take for granted, as granted, the other. Who is granted? It's a grant, it's a gift. It's not economical. You can't, there's no value that you can tag on love or, you know, but somehow it breaks the bank in so many ways that we would want to discuss, you know. So that would be a starting point. Also, if we were to want to instigate a politics of love, I would insist that it's non-unifying, non-fusional or confusional, non-compassionate even, in the sense that Hannah Arendt says, a lot of people think that they have sufficiently paid their political dues by showing compassion. Well, we don't care how you feel when you give a homeless person $1. Good for you. Oh, aren't you great? You feel good now. That's a narcissistic yield or dividend. Save your compassion and just do justice to the other. Just do justice, and your feelings of, you know, of kind of how impressed one is with one's own compassion actually stalls political work, according to Hannah Arendt. So that's a doozy. It's kind of a little non-Christian, a little non-American, but all of the pretentiousness of compassion and feeling, I would throw it out the window and just say, act justly. And then I'm glad if you get off on it. Too bad if you don't. Yeah. Just do it. Yeah.
Hey, thank you for watching and listening. If you think this program is worth a pack of cigarettes or a cheeseburger, you could become a Patreon for as little as $3 a month. The link is available at our website, parcmedia.org. That's PARCmedia.org. Make sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel below. Also, you could find us on Instagram at Parc Media, Facebook at Politics, Art, Roots, Culture, and you could find me on Twitter at Vince Emanuele.